I'm here today to talk about the Voice referendum. So we've got a referendum coming up to vote on the Voice. The call is to alter the Constitution to insert a voice. So my question is, if you're going to alter the Constitution, the first question you should be asking is, what's the Constitution? What is it? And surprisingly, large number of Australians don't really know, because I don't think it's taught in schools and things anymore. So the Constitution, it goes back, if we want to know what the Constitution is, we need to go back in time around 800 years to a rock in the North Atlantic called England, and what was going on there. We had a king by the name of King John, and King John was not very popular, to say the least. To give you an idea of how unpopular he was, to this day, even though John's quite a popular boy's name in England, no king has ever been called John ever since. No monarch will name their children John. After he passed, one of the commenters at the time said, "Foul as it is, hell itself is made fouler with the presence of John." So that gives you an idea of the bloke. He made Joe Biden look like the Easter Bunny. So if you think we've got bad politicians in this day, these guys didn't muck around. So the people were sick to death of King John, and he stepped over the mark, and eventually the people stepped up, and the landowners and the barons and things, they fought him to a standstill, and they sat him down and they forced him to sign a document which is Magna Carta. You would have all heard of the Magna Carta, which was a document which basically said, okay, you can remain king, but you don't just get to do what you want. You're going to be governing with the consent of the governed, which was a really radical thing at that time, because doing what you want was pretty much the job description of a king in those days. So, and the English said, no, you can't do that. So they brought in this concept, and that sounds all fine and dandy, but it's not that easy, as you know. Signing a piece of paper is one thing, but holding these buggers to account is something again. So over the next few hundred years or so, there was wars, there's battles, civil wars, people got their heads lopped off, people got burned at the stake and so forth, and eventually they settled on a system which we call the Westminster system. And it was really brilliant, genius really. So what the Westminster system was that you had a parliament, a lower house which was elected, full of common people, called commoners, so it was known as the House of Commons, and then you had a second house which was the House of Lords, full of lords, and on top of that you had the king. And when the commoners would write laws and come up with laws, that had to be signed off by the House of Lords, and then it went to the king for a signature. And until it was signed by all three groups, it didn't become law. Now, you might say, well, that sounds all great, happy days, but supposing, let's say in our situation, Anthony Albanese decides that, hey, I'm going to be the leader for life. I'm going to pass the law, says no more elections, no more of this mucking around. I'm El Presidente from here on in. And, who could blame him? I mean, the poor bloke he grew up in a council house with a single mum, so he probably thinks he deserves it, So what happens then? Well, I mean, obviously he's supposed to send this to, in our case, the Governor General, who's going to be the representative of the King to sign it. And he says, no, bugger you, off you go, you're out, I'm evicting you. What can the Governor General do about that? Well, quite a lot actually, because the Governor General is in charge of the armed forces. He's El Presidente of the armed forces, so then he can step in, and if it's not signed, he steps in with the army and says, sorry, you're out. Well, supposing that the Governor General says, well, I want to be El Presidente, and says, right, I'm going to throw the Parliament out. Well, the Parliament control all the civic institutions like the police and make all the laws and so forth, and the bureaucracy. So if either of those two were to overstep the line, they're basically in civil war. So you've got like a balance of power going on there. So these guys are restrained by this thing called the Constitution, which I took the time to print out a copy here of the Australian Constitution, which is a document that sets down what each of them has to do and restrains them. It's a set of laws for the people who make the laws. How popular do you reckon this is with the people that make the laws? Not very. They can't stand it. They hate it. I think if you went, I've never been to Parliament House, but I reckon if you went into the toilets in Parliament House, they wouldn't have toilet paper. They've probably got slips of this that they use instead. This is the Constitution. So these people desperately want to change this or to throw it in the bin. If they can change it enough, they don't need to throw it in the bin because they can completely destroy the thing. So the problem for them is that they can't change it without our consent. We, the people, have to give consent before they can change this document. So how do they con us into changing the constitution so those guys can get out of this cage that they're in and become real, grown-up tyrants, like, proper tyrants? Well, they're always trying something, and what they're looking for is maybe we can guilt trip these guys. We can find an issue that sounds like we're really doing a nice thing, that no one can really stand against it without sounding awful, and we'll say, hey, we need to change the constitution because either the dolphins or the fluffy kittens, or in this case they picked on the Aboriginal people who are having a pretty rough time of it by most metrics. So they say, okay, we're going to change the constitution because that's going to help the Aboriginal people. And there's a fair few Aboriginal people jump on board with this because they think that this is going to give them power and happy days. We'll be the ones wielding the clubs here. We'll be the one. We get money, we get power. Sounds great. Well, they're falling for the same trap that the feminists found themselves in years ago, where the feminists found that they could stand up and bash white males, and they get all this power and all this support from the elites, and that was great until the elites got sick of them and said, okay, we found a new group called the trans people, and now the poor old feminists can't even have their own bathrooms and their own sports for themselves. So if they say anything about it, they get called a TERF, is apparently the term. So question. And everybody looks around and thinks, why is it that the elites seem to hate our guts? They treat us with absolute contempt. They're desperate to open the doors and replace us with a whole bunch of people who come from countries very different to ours, who don't have constitutions and have no concept of a constitution or the concept of keeping the leaders in check, and they're all living in these little, more tribal societies where everyone's fighting each other. Why would they do that? Well, it's fairly obvious, of course, that they're finding it difficult to get this stuff past us, the traditional Anglo-descended or British-descended Australians, and same in the UK. Well, if you can't get the people to agree, let's get some new people. It's pretty simple. So this is what they seem to want to do. So what's my position on this? What should we do with the voice? Well, my position is pretty much the same as the British Australian community, and what we've decided was, well, a constitution, it's actually a very fair idea to say that the constitution should name the founding groups or the founding ethnic peoples of the nation. It's pretty, the French constitution should name the French. Chinese constitution should name the Chinese. Now, when Australia was founded, there was two ethnic groups. There was basically the Aboriginals and the British descended, the Anglo settlers who'd come. And the Aboriginals had contributed the land, albeit fairly reluctantly, but they had contributed the land and some aspects of culture. And so we think it's fair that they should be mentioned in the preamble to the Constitution, because the preamble is not the legally binding section, it's the description, and we think it's only fair to mention the Aboriginals in there. But if we're going to mention the Aboriginals, why wouldn't we mention the British settlers who founded the nation, who were by far the majority population at the time, and who created the Commonwealth and wrote the Constitution, who'd fought over the Constitution and shed blood to make sure that the thing worked? That's outrageous not to mention our people. Yeah, sure, put the Aboriginal people in the preamble, but what about us? We should be mentioned as well. And we think that's a very reasonable position that most people and most Australians could get on board with, because most Australians are a very fair-minded people. If we don't look after our constitution and we allow our elites to get out of this cage that they're in, we're not going to get them back in there without bloodshed. Okay? Once you open the door, you don't get them back in without serious problems. And I'll just quote the great Thomas Jefferson, who once said, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. Let's not make it this time." Okay, vote no to the voice. Thank you everyone for listening.